labour by improving labour migration governance. Therefore, my presentation today, I'll be focusing on the issue of trafficking, but from a labour migration and a forced labour lens. I have 3 questions that perhaps we can answer or tackle together. So why is trafficking for forced labour a labour migration and a labour market issue in East and Southeast Asia? I think we've already heard a number of stats being cited this morning on forced labour and labour exploitation, which I think is a big move from when the conversation around trafficking was mainly on trafficking for sexual exploitation. So we've moved well beyond that discussion. I want to discuss the international legal standards on forced labour. And I also want to introduce the new ILO protocol that was introduced just last year in 2014 and look at what the labour approach can bring to anti-trafficking work. To begin with, I want to just show you a very brief 1-minute video. So if I could ask the Secretariat just to show the 1-minute video I've got loaded. It's just to introduce some statistics and to introduce the global picture of forced labour.
Or work in slavery-like conditions. Victims are found in every region of the world. Out of this 21 million, 90% are exploited in the private economy, and 44% of all victims have migrated internally or across borders. Forced labor generates $150 billion in illicit profits annually. Industries and businesses face unfair competition, and states lose billions in tax income and social security contributions. In June 2014, governments, employers, and workers at the ILO International Labour Conference voted overwhelmingly to adopt a new protocol on forced labor. This new legal instrument provides much-needed guidance on how to eliminate all forms of forced labor and sanction perpetrators, including in the identification, protection, rehabilitation of victims and their access to justice and remedies. If you think forced labor has no place in the 21st century, call on your government representatives to support its ratification.
Great, thank you very much. Technology is on your side. What the video didn't mention is a gender breakdown of the data. So 55% of all the victims of forced labour are women and girls, 45% of men and boys, and children make up 1/4 of all the victims. And just as the industries, I think my colleague at the ILO has given us a good overview of 2 of them, domestic work and fishing, but we also need to consider manufacturing, construction, agriculture, entertainment among those. I want to put the data on forced labour into the context of labour migration in the region. So I've pulled up 3 statistics here. First of all, there are 247 million migrants worldwide. That doesn't just include labour migration, that includes other permanent migrants also. Asia hosted 70.8 million of those. And within the ASEAN, there are currently 10 million people living and working within the region. And 6.7 of those are actually from within the region, which means we have huge inter-regional migration flows. The next bit of data is on the deployment statistics of migrant workers in ASEAN member states from 2012, 2013, and 2014. The database comes from the International Labour Migration Statistics Database in ASEAN, which we have been pulling together over the past 3 years. As you have already stated this morning, data is incredibly important for making policy decisions, and for labour migration it is exactly the same. I've got both the total deployment and the percentage deployed to ASEAN member states on the board. And we can see the huge inter-migration flows. So Myanmar sends 92% of its workers to other ASEAN member states, notably Thailand and Malaysia. And the Philippines has the highest total deployment volume, sending over 1 million workers abroad in 2012, but a smaller share of that go to other ASEAN member states, only 17%. So this statistic was already quoted by my colleague, but it's that Nearly half of all victims of forced labour have migrated within their country or across borders. So we see that the movement is a very important vulnerability factor to forced labour. I think in the ASEAN region there is a broad recognition that trafficking occurs within the scope of labour migration, with people, the women, men, children, deceived into exploitative situations during the process of voluntarily moving in the search of decent work, better wages, better working conditions, etc. We've had it quoted in the US TIP report last year that the overwhelming majority of trafficking victims in Thailand and Malaysia are regular and irregular migrant workers from neighbouring countries, and trafficking victims from Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Cambodia are mainly those who have moved in the search of work. I just want to end the data part of my presentation with some data from UNODC, which found that 61% of detected trafficking victims in the Asia Pacific were trafficked for forced labour over the period of 2010 and 2012. Now, how to draw this back to a migration response? Many approaches adopted to prevent and combat the crime of trafficking are in fact measures to strengthen migration management and vice versa. So some of the measures that could be cited include legislation and policies that prevent irregular migration, efforts to regulate recruitment agencies and their unscrupulous practices, information dissemination to migrant workers to mitigate the risks involved in migration. And obviously, we're also assuming that the information will result in behaviour change of the migrant or potential migrant. And also measures to prevent and detect abusive practices against migrant workers. Here we're talking about the role of labour inspectors who are actually at the front line on securing the working conditions of migrant workers and national workers at the workplace. The new ILO protocol that I will discuss in a moment recognises all of this and requires governments to take better measures to protect workers, in particular migrant workers. It also emphasises the role of the employers' organisations and the workers' organisations in this approach. So with that, the second part of my presentation will briefly look at international legal standards on forced labour. Namely, the ILO has two conventions on forced labour, a quite old ILO Convention number 29, signed in 1930, and ILO Convention number 105. They're actually part of the ILO's core and fundamental conventions. That means that any member state of the ILO is bound by these conventions, regardless of whether they have ratified them or not. I would like to say that protection from forced labour is also a fundamental human right. This slide shows the ratification of the ILO Convention number 29. I've also added the UN Trafficking Protocol by the countries in this region, and I've also added ASEAN +3. At the very bottom, not in our region, but Nigeria is the first country to have ratified the new ILO protocol that accompanies Convention number 29. They ratified just in May 2015. The ILO has a global campaign to get more ratifications by 2018 to make this protocol binding and to bring it into force. Okay, what is the ILO definition of forced labour as per our convention? It's all work or service extracted from any person under the menace of any penalty for which the said person has not offered himself or themselves voluntarily. We define forced labour as being imposed by state authorities, by private enterprises, or also by individuals. The concept is quite broadly defined and thus covers a wide range of forced labour practices which occur in all types of economic activity and all parts of the world. Human trafficking is categorised as one aspect of forced labour, so the ILO estimates that have been presented a couple of times today cover the full spectrum of human trafficking. The only exceptions that are not included under this definition but are included in the trafficking protocol are trafficking for organ removal, forced marriage or adoption. The latter two are only included when those result in a situation of forced labour. As mentioned, the word exploitation is yet to be defined by many in the UN community and international community. However, the ILO has developed a list of 11 indicators that might show that a person is trapped in forced labour. I've listed 2 questions that we can ask that perhaps summarise these indicators. Has the person entered the work voluntarily? And are they free to leave employment if they like? And are penalties and threats being used to keep workers from leaving employment? Now, hope is that the ILO indicators can actually be used for states to put these into their legislation so that they can independently define exploitation or forced labour. And I want to cite the case of Malaysia, which has its anti-trafficking guidelines, and in those guidelines it has translated some of the indicators into their own indicators. So, for example, forced labour cases, a forced labour case may be opened if a worker has had their wages withheld for 3 months. My colleagues from Malaysia can perhaps confirm it, but it's a practical use of these indicators. I think our presentation from Jonathan has showed that the indicators of forced labour are commonly experienced by migrant workers. We see the retention of identity documents, the withholding of wages, threat of denunciation to authorities, excessive overtime, and physical and sexual abuse and isolation. I think it would be interesting to actually adapt some of these indicators at an industry level, because for fishing, you might have slightly different indicators of forced labour. The workers are forced to be on the boat for several months at a time. How do we then define restriction of movement, but that is also their workplace and their accommodation. So that is the next step, I think, for the indicators to make them usable. So for the final part of my presentation, I just want to take a look at ILO Convention number 29 and also its new recommendation, protocol and recommendation that were agreed with overwhelming support from tripartite partners. That's the government, the employers and the workers at the International Labour Conference in 2014, just last year. So of course, ILO Convention prohibits the use of forced or compulsory labour in all its forms, and signatories of the Convention must undertake several measures to reduce forced labour, to make it illegal and to punishable as a penal offence, and also ensure that penalties imposed by law are really adequate and strictly enforced. Then the 2014 protocol adds additional measures. It really brings the Convention 29, which was signed in 1930, into today's era and acknowledges the dimensions of forced labour and human trafficking as we see them today. I think importantly, it advances prevention, protection and compensation measures. I want to highlight the role of compensation, because what we often see is that perhaps a worker is exploited overseas or in their country, returns home without their wages and has not met their migration goals. Because there is no access for them to compensation and they have no job at home, they will be forced to migrate again. However, if in that and remigrate, you're open to vulnerability again. However, within that cycle, we can claim compensation for their unpaid wages. They may come home with some savings that they can use for other productive purposes. It may prevent them from having to remigrate or So that's the role of the ILO recommendation protocol. It's really bringing in compensation into the picture. I think also importantly it acknowledges the role of the workers and the employers in addressing forced labour. We've had a lot today about information sharing and the role of other stakeholders. Perhaps my colleague Dr. Thomas will add more on the role of business to address forced labour. Also just to highlight that the protocol creates an explicit link between forced labour and human trafficking. This connection is not necessarily new. Several previous ILO standards, including the ILO Convention on Migrant Workers, signed in 1975, already included provisions to address trafficking in persons. And also the 2005 ILO Multilateral Framework on Labour Migration included guidelines on how states can address trafficking in persons. So I just want to highlight that the nexus of labour migration management and counter-trafficking is apparent in ILO's work on migration. So, for example, the projects that we have on migration currently in the region, we have several regional projects, encourage labour ministries to play a greater role in carrying out initiatives and counter-trafficking action plans, and participate in national and regional counter-trafficking committees. In countries of origin, the ILO works on reducing the vulnerabilities to trafficking. So we support legislation to reduce and eliminate migration costs. We create regulations or assist on creating regulations to recruitment agencies. And we also encourage the private sector to acknowledge its key role as actors in the counter-trafficking efforts. So for example, in Malaysia, the Malaysian Employers Federation conducted research amongst its members and has developed a set of practical guidelines for employers in the recruitment, employment, repatriation of migrant workers, so that they are aware of the labour regulations and immigration laws that apply to migrant workers. At a regional level, the ASEAN Confederation of Employers, which is a regional grouping of employers' organisations in the region, has developed a policy position on business response for forced labour, trafficking in persons. This is still quite new. We're waiting to see the implementation of this also. At a regional level, we've tried to encourage greater cooperation amongst ministries involved in the labour dimensions of human trafficking. In January of this year, we partnered with Active and SOMTC and ACMW to hold a meeting on the labour dimensions of trafficking in persons. I think this was the first time these two groups had come together, and we certainly hope to see more of this type of interministerial coordination. The SOMTC and ACMW members came up with a number of recommendations to advance the issue, and I just want to highlight two. I think the recommendations are on your USB if you wish to look at them in more detail. But one is to develop ASEAN common regional indicators, practices, standards, and criteria for the identification of labour trafficking victims. That's one. The second one is to acknowledge better collaboration between law enforcement and labour administrators, in particular labour inspectors, who as I said before, at the front line of inspecting the working conditions, and can play a greater role in identifying trafficking victims. Okay. There are certainly a lot of challenges that we still need to address in this response to trafficking for labour exploitation. One question I have is whether we're looking enough at the demand factors driving trafficking. Because I think often we focus on supply-driven responses. For example, information campaigns that try to change the migrants' behaviour without addressing the underlying push factors that are causing them to migrate. My colleague has said that they're young, willing to take on risks, they're wanting to earn money. Just by being provided information doesn't mean that they won't migrate. Also, perhaps if we focus only on recruitment regulations, we might make legal migration too difficult, and thus pushing migrant workers into irregular channels, because they will still be searching for work regardless of the regulations in place. I think it's also sometimes easier to provide information to migrants about safe migration rather than connecting the migrants with good employers. So some countries already have practices in place for their vetting the employers in the country of destination, the Philippines being one of these countries. And they also have joint liability between the employers that the Philippines Overseas Labour Office has vetted and the recruitment agency, so that if any exploitation occurs, the worker can return home and file for compensation back in the Philippines. I've also mentioned some of the challenges. There are, of course, interministerial coordination. It's not just the labour ministries, it's just not just the criminal justice ministries. It's an interministerial solution that needs to be, interministerial coordination mechanisms need to be created to find a solution to this issue. And of course, when we talk about labour trafficking, we're also talking about men being trafficked, and often there is issues of providing services to men. Perhaps some services for trafficking victims are mainly targeted at women, so we still have issues with men self-identifying as victims and being provided with rehabilitation services. And of course, any assistance package needs to be targeted at the individual and the types of exploitation they have faced. I'll end my presentation there.